For millions of Christians today, the ritual of communion presents itself as an unbroken line of practice. The modern perception is that the Lord's Supper is a highly standardized sacrament derived directly and solely from the events of the Last Supper. But the historical record reveals a different reality. When we examine the earliest surviving documents of the Christian Church, we do not find a single uniform practice. Instead, we see a spectrum of competing traditions, with different communities interpreting the meaning of their sacred meals in surprisingly diverse ways. We can see this tension most clearly by looking at two texts that emerged from very similar Jewish Christian circles in the late 1st century, the Gospel of Matthew and a primitive church manual known as the Didache. By tracking how these early communal meals evolved from eschatological banquets of thanksgiving into a formal sacrifice at a morning altar, we uncover the origins of the theological divides that persist today. The distance between these two ancient manuscripts maps directly onto the modern debate between Reformed and Roman Catholic views on Christ's presence in the elements. To understand the baseline of the Last Supper tradition, we have to ground ourselves in the 1st century environment of the early Jewish Christian communities in and around Jerusalem. In this setting, the Gospel of Matthew preserves what we recognize as the traditional Last Supper narrative. During a Passover meal, Jesus explicitly identifies the elements with himself, instructing his disciples to take the bread as his body and the wine as his blood. Matthew's Christology is heavily sacrificial, tied directly to covenant theology. Jesus states his blood is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. This establishes a backward-looking memorial. The community anchors its identity in the Passion, requiring them to look to the cross. For the community behind Matthew's Gospel, the sacred meal functions as an act of covenantal remembrance. At its center is the physical, sacrificial death of Jesus. Yet, in chapters 9 and 10 of the Didache, a text dating to roughly the same period, we find entirely different instructions. Here, the cup is blessed first, followed by the bread. What immediately stands out are the glaring omissions. There is no mention of a crucifixion or atonement. The words, "This is my body" and "This is my blood" are entirely absent. Instead, the Didache uses a primitive Christological language. It repeatedly refers to Jesus as God's servant, or pais in Greek. It does not frame him as a sacrificial covenant mediator in these prayers. Rather than looking back at the cross, the meal in the Didache is forward-looking. The community offers thanks for the holy vine of David and prays for the church to be unified and gathered from the ends of the earth into the coming kingdom. This tension leads scholars to conclude that the Didache preserves an older form of Christian gathering. Before the Last Supper narrative became the strict liturgical template, believers gathered for the agape, an ordinary fellowship meal focused on community and eschatological anticipation. The meal is defined by gratitude. In fact, the Greek term Eucharistia, which the Didache uses to describe this prayer, literally translates to thanksgiving. The survival of the Didache proves that atonement theology was not the primary focus of all early Christian meals. For some communities, the gathering was defined entirely by fellowship and hope for the imminent kingdom. The breaking of bread in the Book of Acts describes a full communal banquet, hosted in the evening within private house dining rooms. But an evening feast invites complications. Paul's letters record serious abuses of the Lord's Supper, where wealthy Christians treated the gathering like a standard Greco-Roman banquet, eating their fill and drinking heavily while poorer members went hungry. By the 3rd century, writers like Tertullian and Cyprian document a drastic shift. The evening banquet declines in popularity. The meal separates from dinner entirely, moving to the morning, and transitions into a highly restricted, ritualized ceremony. At the same time, Christians faced intense cultural pressure from the surrounding Roman society to offer altar sacrifices to the civic gods. In response, Christian theology adapted, beginning to perceive the bread and wine itself as a Christian oblation, or sacrificial offering. This theological shift required an architectural shift. As the church grew, domestic dining rooms lacked the capacity for the assembly. Christians required dedicated religious buildings focused around a central altar. The resulting monumental Eucharist of the 3rd century was a direct response to both numerical growth and cultural conflict. The intimate, Thanksgiving-based house meal of the 1st century was left behind. This historical record remains highly relevant because it informs modern debates regarding Christ's presence in the elements. Specifically, we have to look at whether the primitive text of the Didache supports the Roman Catholic view of transubstantiation or the Reformed view of spiritual presence. The Reformed argument points to the specific language of chapter 9. The Didache assigns entirely separate prayers to the cup and the bread. The bread is linked to life and knowledge, while the cup is linked to the vine of David. This suggests the elements remain literal bread and wine, serving as physical channels that represent distinct spiritual realities. The Catholic defense against this argues that the Didache only records the prayers said before the consecration of the host. They posit that the community already knew the Gospel of Matthew, and therefore the words of institution, "This is my body," were simply assumed, not omitted. The Didache's thanksgiving for spiritual food and drink in chapter 10 comes with a specific boundary. It is granted only to those with faith. This highlights a core theological divide. While some traditions view the transformation of the elements as an objective reality that occurs on the altar, the Didache presents a meal where the grace received is conditional. For the Reformed perspective, this suggests that the presence of Christ is encountered through the believer's faith, rather than through an objective change in the physical substance of the bread. A common counter-argument relies on chapter 14 of the Didache, where the text repeatedly uses the word sacrifice. The Catholic claim is that this confirms the early Church viewed the Eucharist as a propitiatory act to atone for sins. But we have to read the word sacrifice in its context. The Didache quotes a specific Old Testament prophecy from Malachi chapter 1. In Leviticus, the pure sacrifice described by Malachi is a grain offering. A grain offering was an act of thanksgiving for what God had provided, rather than a burnt offering meant for propitiation. By framing the meal around faith-dependent grace and thanksgiving, the Didache provides a historical precedent for a sacramentology that prioritizes the spiritual state of the believer over the objective ritual sacrifice of the priest. Within 3 centuries, Christian practice traveled a massive distance. It moved from the eschatological fellowship preserved in the Didache, absorbed the sacrificial memorial found in Matthew, and eventually hardened into the formal morning rituals of the 3rd century. Acknowledging this diversity does not diminish the historical validity of the Eucharist. Rather, it demonstrates how the earliest believers celebrated Jesus using frameworks that addressed their immediate communal needs. The shift from a private meal to a public monument was driven by both deliberate theological development and inescapable sociological pressures. Today, the Didache stands as a vital snapshot of primitive Christianity, a community that prioritized unity, gratitude, and the anticipation of a coming kingdom over a formalized ritual of sacrifice. The manuscript record proves that even the most sacred of traditions do not arrive fully formed. They carry a complex, human, and deeply diverse evolution.